This is Guy Burgess. I want to talk about something we call the market metaphor, which is really another strategy for thinking about large-scale, very complex, very intractable conflicts. Now remember, the big question that we've been asking over the last series of posts is how do you promote more constructive approaches to conflict when you're working at this very large scale of societies involving millions and millions of people? We got a couple of goals here. One is we want to increase the utilization of existing good ideas. And then, of course, we want to create better ideas. But the big thing is to implement these ideas at the massive scale of contemporary society. So in this layer cake diagram below, what we want to do is decrease the proportion of conflict interactions that are destructive and increase the proportion of constructive interactions or corrected destructive interactions. And over again, the last series of posts, we've raised a lot of issues that highlight difficulties in doing this. Now, we've gone back and we've talked about complex and complicated approaches in the engineering model and in the notion that you try to come up with this perfect plan and implement it through unity of effort and the chain of command and get everybody on the same page doing the same thing and it all works out. But then we talk about how the fog of war, just the sort of squishy influence that we all have, and even the most powerful people within society are really only able to influence a relatively small circle of folks around them, though they can have an influence, but I mean decisively influence. So there's problems with the centrally planned approach or the power over approach. And one, in order for it to work, it's got to have incentives. Somehow or another, you got to get everybody to do the same thing. And that implies that there are sanctions for folks who don't. And that raises conflicts of interest between the elites, the central planners, and then the masses of the society that are being told what to do. And you've got all sorts of conflicts of interest tied up in this. And the truth is that when you have those kinds of conflicts of interest and the enormous power that comes from dictating the central plan, you run into the power corrupts problem. And that's part of why it doesn't work. If you go back and you look at the big history of what we learned from the Cold War, at least ideally, I suppose we might be revising this a little bit these days, but the notion was that centrally planned economies didn't work very well, in part because they were subject to corruption, and in part because it was awfully hard to figure out what everybody thought needed to be done. And so they were just vastly less efficient, less able to deliver the kinds of things their societies wanted. The other problem with centrally planned approaches is we lack a consensus on what approach to take. I mean, just look at C-SPAN and we can't agree on much of anything these days. So the question becomes, how do we apply the alternative to the sort of engineering, centrally planned command and control approach, which is the medical model that I raised a couple of posts earlier, where you try to focus on individual pathology. But what we're doing here is looking at the medical model at a very large scale. So it isn't just the treatment of one disease in one individual, but you have gigantic healthcare complexes and campuses and clinics all over the country with dozens and dozens of specialists, each focusing on a different medical pathology and providing treatment. You have tied in with this a whole lot of self-help things tied into the mass media, health columns that tell you how to deal, and a lot of this gets coordinated by giant institutions like the National Institutes of Health. So that's what we're trying to figure out, is how to create something sort of on that scale. And last time I talked about the traffic system metaphor, the Google traffic metaphor. That's one approach. Another approach, which I want to highlight in this post, is something I call the market strategy or an ecosystem strategy. The truth is markets are ecosystems. They're social ecosystems, but there's the same sort of competition and a lot of the same kind of dynamics play out. And here what we're trying to do is to harness the power of the invisible hand, that get people to do things because they want to, because they think they're in their best interests. And we've talked a lot about this again over the last series of posts, and talked about the tension between exchange and persuasion and force and the power strategy mix, and this distinction between the invisible hand and the invisible fist. So what we're looking for here is not a force-based strategy. Force-based invisible fist strategies rely on have-to power. People are forced to do something because they have to. And that tends to create a backlash effect, that people hate being forced to do things against their will, and you'll actually find that you're generating new enemies faster than you're defeating old ones. So we're trying to pursue this idea of want-to power instead, or the invisible hand. The other advantage of this market-based approach is, instead of trying to come up with the perfect pool shot that I've been talking about again in some of the earlier posts, all this involves is a kind of essentially a bilateral agreement between any two parties that, if we work together on this, that'll be to our enlightened best interest. And the goal is to get lots and lots of these binary, and they can be more than two-party things, agreements where people work together in their enlightened best interest, that tends to push in the aggregate society more toward the democratic end of the continuum, and away from autocracy and anocracy, the power over world that we've been trying to avoid. And the thing about this small setting is that makes the more complicated, more engineering-based approach actually work. When you start thinking in small-scale interactions, that gets back into the area where people have real strength, and you can work out things that have a much higher likelihood of working, and in aggregate, they can push society again in the right direction. So the key to making markets work is just matching buyers and sellers and finding. So then the question is, well, what can you trade in these markets? And traditionally, economists talk about the exchange of goods and services. In our context, we can also add to that the exchange of expertise. People who have expertise in more constructive ways of dealing with conflict can share that expertise with others. And then you can, of course, make deals on how you handle particular conflicts and disputes. And the other big thing about markets is the law of supply and demand actually applies. And if we can hold the costs down of more constructive approaches to conflict, then the demand is likely to go up. Right now, professional intervention is too pricey for all but a very few number of high-profile conflict interactions. So the trick to doing this is to build do-it-yourself skills. And so rather than having the pros from Dover come in and do this, try to teach people how to do it themselves. Now, there are a lot of different kinds of ways of thinking about markets. There's the old-fashioned market, maybe exemplified by the Yellow Pages, where you had a comprehensive index of all the goods and services available in a community. Everybody had a pretty intuitive sense of what was in it. You just looked up what you needed. It was great for handling business as usual kinds of transactions. And the Google search system sort of does this, but it doesn't really have this nice index that the old-fashioned Yellow Pages had. But then you get new markets, like eBay or Airbnb or Uber, that make it possible for buyers and sellers to come together in transactions that used to be impossible because the transaction costs were just too high. And this is something that information technology has made possible. And in many ways, I think what we need is a conflict eBay, a new market for conflict services that would generate a virtuous circle where people wishing for or looking for newer and better ideas, strategies for dealing with conflict can find them. People with those ideas can develop them because they know they'll be able to sell them. And this creates new jobs, and it increases the skill level of the society as a whole. And this works as well when you're providing conflict services, and it also works for just increasing skills and providing capacity building services. Now, the other thing we're trying to do is to improve the conflict handling skills that are available. And in one sense, you can have a notion that, well, let's just take an existing thing that people do, or like an existing car, and improve it a little bit. And there's a real incentive here, and a good conflict market could encourage people to make incremental improvements to existing strategies for dealing with conflict. So that's one set of things we want to be able to do. But we also want to encourage radically new things, like the iPhone, which came out of nowhere when it was originally proposed. All sorts of bigwig technology folks said, this will never fly. But it was a huge paradigm-shifting technology. Now, there's some ideas we need for dealing with conflict that also need to be really big and radically new, not just incremental improvements in what we've been doing before. So we want a conflict skill market for both improvements in skills and some radically new ideas, which we've got to also encourage folks to develop. The other thing that's important about markets is you've got to make people aware of them. This is where advertising comes in. Otherwise, word of mouth just takes forever. One of the advantages of living in the era of social marketing and viral media is that a really good idea can take off and spread literally around the planet in a very short amount of time. So that's something that we can try to develop as part of this effort to develop a new market in conflict handling skills. It's also, in this context, worth thinking about a distinction that Kenneth Boulding made between the market economy and the grants economy, where the regular economy or the market economy is a straightforward financial transaction. And that's where most of the money is and most of the transactions. There's also a lot of grants where somebody gives something to somebody else because it's the right thing to do rather than they expect something in return. And that drives an awful lot of the transactions within families and within groups. And then in this chart, there's a small little sliver, the green section, which is the grants economy or the philanthropic sector. And that's where the conflict profession is largely operated. We go out, we get grants, we do projects. The problem is that there isn't all that much money in this part of the economy. The advantage of making this market-based approach work is all of a sudden you can tap into the vast bulk of the economy and provide people with services and knowledge that they're willing to pay for. And part of the ability to do that is hold the costs down. Still, it's worth highlighting for a few minutes that there is a nonprofit sector of the exchange system, and this is 501c3 nonprofits and this new generation of B corporations that are legally obligated to advance the common good and not just the bottom line. But in talking about this market-based approach, it's worth spending a couple of minutes acknowledging that there are failures of the marketplace that lead it to do destructive things that we need to find ways of guarding against. Throwing a monkey wrench in the system, and here it applies whether you're dealing with very simple markets in developing countries or the New York Stock Exchange. One problem is deceptive marketing, that it's real easy for people to promise that they've got approaches that are really great, but they just don't work, or they actually wind up being counterproductive. This is Mr. Ponzi, the inventor of the Ponzi scheme. He's probably as good a poster child for this as anybody else. There's also the tendency of markets to concentrate wealth and power, and there's also a danger that this market in conflict skills will tend to concentrate power in the hands of people who basically wind up selling self-serving things. So you've got to guard against that somehow. You've also got to deal with the posterity trap, the tendency of getting people to resolve short-term disputes on the backs of future generations. And that's a huge problem in climate change and lots of other areas. So the bottom line here is that one of the reasons for looking at this market-based approach, apart from the fact that it really does scale, is that that's where the money is, that's where the resources are, and that's what it's going to take to get peace building and conflict resolution and all of this out of the niche market that it is and into the mainstream of society.